So, some of you may know I have an email account at AskVosh. Wait, not at AskVosh. That'd be for Twitter. It's askvosh@gmail.com. And if you are a conservative or a centrist or, I don't know, to the right of Biden, then you should send me an email there asking questions, and maybe I'll respond to them here on stream. I used to want questions from liberals too, but then I realized all you guys ask me are the same 3 questions. And when lefties email me, it's an incomprehensible fucking deluge of hyper-specific questions regarding theory and the clarification of ideas nobody cares about. So, conservatives and centrists, hello, my friends. I'm going to read out some emails and respond to them. Of course, if you email, your identity is protected, blah, blah. A person called What's It Like asks this. Hello, Vosh. I'm a conservative and have been for the past 20 years. However, I would like to move towards centrist or further, but I think the news I currently watch isn't helping. Through watching your content now, I've learned Fox News should be avoided at all costs. I watched Fox News for years and never saw anything wrong with it until recently. My question is, who should I avoid as far as news outlets and certain people on the right? And who do you recommend I stick with? So my suggestion with this one, this is a common question that I get. How do you get a good media diet? That's basically the question. Because people are largely a product of their environment, and we shape our environments now by choosing what content to watch. A person who watches Newsmax and OAN is going to end up with a very different perspective on reality than a person who watches MSNBC or further over like Sam Cedar and Kyle Kalinske. I would ask that you not refine who you watch, but rather refine the methods by which you determine the legitimacy of what you watch. That's the key, and that's what I did. I have watched Fox News segments. I've watched Tucker Carlson segments and gotten useful information out of it. The key is to recognize when you're being lied to, and more importantly, when the person talking to you has a bias. All media has a bias. Even the best, even the quote-unquote impartial media, even NPR, it all has a bias. And when you watch that media, you need to be thinking critically. You need to be thinking, what are they trying to sell me on right now? Are they editorializing this in any way? Is there another perspective that could be had on this? You should always be asking that. Is there another perspective? And of course, there's always another perspective, but the real question is there a good other perspective? And the answer often is yes. Even if you're watching left-leaning stuff, even if you're based in left-build and what have you, I often suggest that people take the time to take a look at liberal perspectives as well, because leftism, or I should be more clear, leftist media, while it's certainly my preferred media source, and it must be your guys's too because you're watching me, that doesn't change the fact that everyone is looking at the world through their own lenses of analysis. And there are considerations that sometimes lefties typically miss because they're more suited for a liberal approach. It's all about knowing what to take from those sources. That's the goal. Generally, Fox News has fairly biased perspective, so it's good to be skeptical there. Anyway, it's not an easy process. Then we get from a grand exalted master. They apologize for the cringy name of their email address. They say questions about the U.S. military. I'm rather curious about this. You've talked about the influence of American intelligence agencies in other countries before, but I'm curious as to what you think the role of the American military should be in the world. Should it be used to project power abroad? Should it be used in a strictly defensive capacity? What are your thoughts on this? So, that's a really interesting question. The answer to it is that there are a lot of lefties who talk about military abolition. These lefties are idiots. You should never listen to them. We do live in a world of realpolitik. America has foreign enemies. If America just abolished its military, there would be disastrous consequences for a wide variety of reasons, in part because other countries rely on our military support, and in part because the balance of power is controlled in part by the implicit threat that our military represents should we ever mobilize it. There's nothing wrong with having a military. Socialist countries have had militaries. I don't know why we'd be against it principally. The goal is that we should use the military and our intelligence agencies in the best possible ways. Insofar as we have nation states, those nation states will have conflicting interests. Sometimes those conflicting interests will literally just be a matter of perspective. A trade deal. Who benefits from it more? They argue, they negotiate, they bargain. Phenomenal. You don't need the military there. but sometimes there will be instances where the interactions between other nation states merits a military response. I believe it's possible to humanely intervene in conflicts abroad. I think that's a thing that could potentially be done. Is that something America tends to do? No. No, not at all. Not even remotely. But there are places around the world, like, say, for example, Yemen, where I do think that a deliberate peacekeeping effort could potentially be incredibly beneficial as long as it was done with sort of an international focus and it was handled appropriately and responsibly. And that would be my goal moving forward. Is there a way to use the military for peace, for real peacekeeping, not for shutting down or silencing other governments, not for initiating coups, not for invading or engaging in ground wars, but to deter bad actors from hurting innocent people? Intelligence agencies are a little more complicated. All countries have intelligence agencies. They're a necessary part of how countries operate, because if you didn't have one, you would be incredibly vulnerable to other nations' intelligence agencies. But likewise, I think that intelligence agencies, generally speaking, just fulfill the purpose of defending the status quo of the country that they serve. You know, that's the FBI and the CIA's job. America is a destructive capitalist country that engages in imperialism, so the FBI and the CIA do what they need to preserve that. If we had a better country, I think it would be possible for our intelligence agencies to do better work. But realistically, there's always going to be some sus shit going on with intel agencies. I kind of feel like that's just how they work. But yeah, the goal would be to do what you could with them as good as possible. Yeah. Intelligence agencies are a lot like nuclear weapons. When people have them, they ensure like mutually assured destruction, which is preferable to only one group having them, because then there's nothing that would stop them from doing whatever they wanted, which would be bad. That would be bad, you know. We have a person called Just Me again. They say this. I've been a fan of you for quite a few months now and have been questioning my previously conservative political stances for nearly a year. I don't believe myself to be an anti-Semite. Wait, hold on 1 second. Clarification for chat. The U.S. should not do peacekeeping if it's not done via the UN. I generally agree. I think the only way to effectively manage peacekeeping operations is through a multilateral international approach. I do generally think that's the case. The fewer nations are involved in this, the easier it is for those desires to go astray. I don't believe myself to be an anti-Semite. I don't think there's some huge conspiracy about the Jews, and I don't deny the existence of the Holocaust. Back when I did consider myself to be a conservative, I convinced myself that the 6 million figure was inflated by the US to push more young men to enlist in the military, but I'd love to know your opinion of it. Yeah, so there's not really a relationship between the 6 million death statistic and the number of young men who enlist in the military. So this is part of a narrative, and the narrative is that Jews will weaponize sympathy towards them as a product of the Holocaust in order to get more out of what? Out of America, out of white people. It depends on who you ask. Now, there is something to be said about the idea that governments can exaggerate crimes in order to prompt really bad social norms. 9/11 is a great example of this. 9/11, where about 3,000 Americans died, the media circus that took place after that prompted an attack on Iraq that has led to an unbelievable number of people dying, which is not good. But the fact of the matter is, and think about 9/11, they didn't have to inflate the death toll for 9/11 at all. What they had to do was prop up the media narrative. The fact of the matter is that the 6 million figure didn't come about until after World War II, and it's been corroborated amongst a fuck ton of countries and academic sources. The number itself, I believe the range of, like, expected Jewish deaths was between 5.8 and 6.2 million. And this is after an unfathomable amount of historical research. The Holocaust is, I believe, like, the most studied historical event, like, pretty much period, you know, relative to the actual size of the event. Like, there's an unfathomable amount of info that goes into it. And after World War II, after the camps were liberated, the United States military actually went through the camps and they were ordered to take photos of everything. And we still have those photos today. And the reason for that is because Roosevelt was concerned that people would make conspiracy from this after the fact. So he wanted to document it as well as he could. And he ended up being completely right, in spite of how much documentation was taken. The fact of the matter is that the evidence towards 6 million is incredibly strong. And even if it wasn't, who benefits from inflating that number? Like, are there really any political aims or any... Oh, sorry, Churchill? It was Churchill who did that, not Roosevelt? My apologies. Or Truman would have, yeah, because Roosevelt would have been dead by then. My apologies. Nobody really stands to gain from that. You would have to supply false information and completely censor the academic discourse, which would involve the efforts of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who work in academia or in the higher levels of government. And the goal for this would be what? To take a real Holocaust, but make the numbers a bit bigger? I don't think it fits together. The 6 million statistic is pretty strong. It's very well corroborated. If there is any argument to be made that young men are being pushed into the military because of disinformation, that disinformation would be 9/11 tier shit. It would be the American government constantly hyping up the foreign threat of Islam and how they're going to come over here and kill all your women or whatever. That if you want to talk about lies that push kids into the military, there are some very obvious targets that you can go to without denying the Holocaust numbers. Yeah, disinformation on military welfare as well. Yeah, that kind of stuff, yeah. Could you comment on the argument we should have gotten into World War II because the Nazi regime would have inevitably collapsed? What does that mean? I mean, what? If you see a person who's in trouble because they're about to fall off a cliff and there's somebody trying to help them up, you should run and help them up too. Imagine if you just stood there and when the person eventually gets up, you're well, you seem like you handled it. What do you mean? We should all get involved in the international pastime of fash bashing. You get it. From Auto-Tuned. Was it Eisenhower? Oh, okay, it was Eisenhower. Yeah, if it was the U.S. military, it was Eisenhower who did it. Gender wage gap and nature versus nurture. So there's a lot of text here, but the basic gist of this is to what extent do physiological differences dictate the wage gap and the types of jobs that men and women get respectively? The argument was that, this is a quote, "There is a difference in nature we should account for descriptively, that just because of the fact women can have babies, they choose jobs with less hours of labor and therefore with lower pay." Would you consider this a significant enough difference to call it a difference in nature? Or is it just another element of nurture? So this is kind of a half argument. Obviously, social forces pressure men and women into different jobs. We know this. There are a million studies on this. When you normalize a man doing a certain job socially, more men go into it. If you normalize women going into a certain job socially, more women go into it. We know that. And we know that one of the best examples of this is that back in the very beginning of the computer industry, the very, very beginning, women and men were basically equally represented in the field. But when computers became cheap enough to be marketed as a consumer good, they were marketed as a boy's toy, like a guy thing to do. And then after that, the proportional representation of women in the field declined, though it's been getting back up in recent years. You can see a lot of similar stuff happening in other fields. The basic gist of it is people go where they're told to go, Not every individual, but collectively there is a social pressure that disproportionately affects women and men in different directions. So, physiologically, there are also differences between cis men and cis women that do affect their proportional representation in ways that I think would continue to be an issue, even in a perfectly gender equal society. Let's say we abolish gender. Completely. Let's say we completely abolish gender, okay? It's not. You can be whatever you want, identify whatever. However, some people are born with penises. Some people are born with vaginas. The people who are born with penises tend to be bigger and grow facial hair. Not always, but we have the sexes as we know them. In that instance, even with no social pressures whatsoever associated with sex, really hard manual labor jobs are probably still mostly going to go to the people born with penises, to what we call cis men now. The vast majority, I would say, or not the vast majority, but there would be a statistically significant difference there. There are probably some fields where there is some sort of biological inclination. Like hard manual labor, probably more to cis men. Nursing, I can see, or like caregiving might be biased in favor of cisgender women. That being said, these are, I know women that do hard manual labor. Yeah, but you know more men who do it. These are, I think these would be relatively slight differences, but the subsequent argument that just because there are physiological differences, thus means that we should accept bias and discrimination, I think that's ridiculous. Women don't choose jobs with less hours of labor and therefore with lower pay. Like, women choose jobs that they're socially inclined to take. And America is like the only country in the developed world that has such pathetically low maternity leave expectations. If we had maternity and paternity leave set at an equal level, we would completely, and I mean literally 100%, get rid of all bias that pregnancy has on the viability of an employment via gender. Which is a good idea anyway, because if you're a father, you should be able to be with your kid. I think that's a simple argument anyway. Wait, you have no paid maternity or paternity leave? We have no paternity leave, and maternity leave is very low, but varies. If you're a father, you should be able to spend time with your kid too. Take a couple months. I don't know what the standard amount is. I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months. You think men would want that? Well, if it's paid leave, then I would think so. I think they'd want that probably. Yeah, I imagine, that would be nice. Anyway, there are some minor physiological differences. There are massive social biases, and a lot of the physiological biases can be shored up with good policy. And that policy would be beneficial to the people of this country and to America. So I think we should do it. I think it'd be poggers, essentially. It's my opinion. My humble opinion. Here we go. We have a couple of really good questions here. This email was actually good enough that I forwarded it to this email, even though it was sent to the wrong one. This is from, I didn't say how to call him. I'll just say they're Nate. I want to start this off by saying what I'm writing you for. I don't agree with a lot of what you talk about, and I don't want to debate. I only want clarification, as I'm open to new ideas and wouldn't actively dislike people with these ideas. Maybe my friends are onto something by listening to you. There are a few questions I have, and I'd like you to answer them in simple terms, as I am not a political expert. Okay? First off, would a very left-wing government, quote-unquote, stay out of my life? As I'm someone who doesn't really want a huge government telling me what to do. I don't want the government to force me to do things such as vote, have to deal with bureaucracy, or pay heavy economic fines. So it depends on your definition here, and it depends what you mean by very left-wing government. I'm going to answer your question as, do I answer this question like a social democracy or like a socialist government? I'll say this much. It depends on the ways in which you want the government to stay out of your life. I do believe that a good and fair left-leaning society will have heavy taxes, and that it will pay back those taxes with very strong institutions. So that while you are paying a good stip into the government, you are getting it back many times over with the comparative efficiency by which the state is capable of providing things like healthcare, education, roads, what have you. But in terms of like the government directly getting involved in your life, I think your main concern, your real concern, should be surveillance. It should be surveillance. It should be police. It should be social regressivism, like all the Republicans in government who want to. We had that bill recently introduced where that Republican proposed a trans bathroom bill that would have little girls having their genitals inspected. Very nice, great. That to me is what I think of when I think of the government's like involving itself in my life. That's what I imagine. So I argue that a government which allows people to do what they want as long as it's not hurting other people and is consensual, a government that affords you the ability to live a dignified life through strong institutions, and a government which doesn't surveil you. I think that is a government that stays out of your life, in my opinion. Next up, taxes. The ultimate question. I'm not one of those people that are like, I'm going to make $45K a year. Joe Biden / AOC are going to raise my taxes. Obviously, I know it will be those with more money paying taxes. But I do know in Europe there are heavy taxes. How much taxes would, say, a teacher have to deal with getting taken out of his paycheck in a left-wing government? I want to be able to buy a nice house and drive a decent car while being a teacher. Would this happen? I will say this. So taxes may raise. Wages should raise with them. I can't speak to the exact tax rate because that would really depend on income, and it would depend on how much you're getting back too. But yeah, with how much teachers currently make, they're probably paying like zero taxes anyway. So yeah, wouldn't worry too much on their behalf. Ideally, I think that even in a society where taxes are raised, you have a higher standard of living because your income is raised as well, and you're getting more back for the taxes you pay. Because it feels like you're not getting much for your taxes right now because so little of it actually goes back to the operation of the society that you live in, you know? So much of it goes towards social security, which you'll benefit from down the line. The military, you have a bunch of obligations the government has to pay out, but like the roads are shit, the schools are shit, the healthcare is shit. Like it feels like you're getting very little back for it. I'll say this much. Right now, Americans have a pretty low standard of living relative to the GDP of the country. So any tax bracket system which incurs upon the working class a lower standard of living is not one which I would support, and I would rather tax less than burden the working class more. I can only answer in priorities here. Anything else would require really specific, numbers. Sports. Hello. Like many other Americans, sports are a practically integral part of life for me. Under a left-wing government, will I still be able to go to sports games, follow sports, and purchase sports-related items? Yes, absolutely, undeniably, absolutely undeniably. In fact, one of the big reasons why people support the abolition of, I hate sports, by the way, so I'm throwing it out here for you. One of the big reasons why people support the abolition of capitalism is because right now all free time is commodified. Everything that's done, all of it's done for a profit. Anytime any work is done, someone somewhere has to be making money from it, unless it's government work, in which case it has to be paid for by taxes and it has to go through committee and blah, blah. But the goal in a just society, I think, would be that individuals should have more leisure time, and that leisure time should be spent pursuing what they find engaging. I think that sports would benefit significantly, in fact, from a socialist government, because right now the like sports are like a dystopic fucking nightmare. Like really poor people desperately play ball in the hopes that they get scouted like out of school, and they get picked up, and they go from having nothing to having everything in the world. And then the sports, and in college they get fucked because they don't make any money from it, even though the industry, the college sports industry, makes a fuck ton of money off of them. They get nothing. And then it goes into the professional leagues, and this like infinite amounts of money are being batted around for public amusement. But sports is a very elitist like institution in America right now that excludes a lot of people. I think that as leisure time is made more available to the average American, it'll be easier for people to organically form a community basis for engaging in sports, which would be preferable, you know? I think that'd be, you know what I mean? Chat, you know what I'm talking about, right? You know what I'm talking about. Also, patriotism. I'm a pretty patriotic American. I like living here. I'm content with never leaving and will live here the rest of my life. Will I still be able to say I'm a proud American, display an American flag on my property, and live in the United States instead of a radically different country? Look, lefties will call it cringe posting, but of course you'll be able to. I don't know why a socialist government would ever prevent its citizens from flying the flag of its country. Yeah, no, you're fine and dandy. Don't you worry. Though, I mean, people might tell you it's cringe. Some of the people in chat might, but yeah, no, that's a right you have. And last things last, individualism. Left-wing ideals are very much about coming together as a collective and that we should focus on the good of the community or whatever. I'm a much more individualist person, and I'd rather focus on my needs instead of the needs of a bunch of people. Would I be able to mostly focus on myself or deal with the needs and wants of other people instead of mine? I take a kind of an egoist perspective on this. I think that socialism is the achievement of the ultimate individualist dream. That one of the problems we have right now is that the American government is collectivist. We just don't see the collectivism because it's been normalized and taught to us to be individualist. Like military fetishism, the patriotism that you just described is undeniably a form of collective thought. Or the ways in which we're like encouraged to be subservient to the economic interests of the businesses that lord over us. Socialism is all about incentivizing the greatest possible good for the individual. And I think that's great because I think you can set up individual incentives in a way that turn a culture, a country, communally oriented. But people should engage with their community out of self-interest. I think that works best. And if you build a society correctly, you can do that too. The collective identity is great and all, but as an individual, you should be incentivized to build your community up. And to an extent, in some ways, in America today we are. There are ways in which we do that. That's how you build a successful society, but I think we can improve on it. One of the big ways you can improve on it is through worker cooperatives. People say worker cooperatives are collectivist because things are collectively owned. What's more individually preferable than having a stake in the company you work for? What's collectivist is having a fucking fat cat sit on the entire employee base of a business and expect all of them to just do whatever they're told to do. That's collectivist. It's not even collectivist. You don't even get, it's not collectivist or individualist. You don't get the benefits of either of them. You don't get the collective action, and you also don't get the satisfaction of having a mastery over your own fate. It's just dumb. Yeah, those damn fat cats. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, Nate, thank you very much for the email. I appreciate that. We got 2 more emails that I want to take a peek at. This one had 2? This one has quite a few. I'm a conservative. This is from Joe. I'm a conservative pro-capitalist. I just want to say I support free speech and your constitutional right to your opinion and ability for your broadcasts. I hope you continue. Although obviously I disagree with some of your opinions, it's one of the best parts of the Constitution and this country. Thank you. I appreciate that. My child has introduced me to your work, and I've watched some of your videos. I'm constantly finding myself challenging your assumptions used in your arguments. It's obvious there are things I don't understand, so to learn your worldview, I have questions about your version of socialism. If you could please answer, because my teenage kid does not know the answer. All right. Number 1. What is your definition of socialism? Because when the kid who's making their arguments to defend it says they don't know the correct words, but it's when workers own the means of production, well, in Webster's, that's the 3rd or the 4th definition. So question number 1, what does that mean? So there are 2 components to socialism. One thing that you have to recognize is that, like capitalism, socialism is a broad spectrum that encompasses a wide variety of possible governments. There are many capitalist governments in existence right now with many differences between them. So a socialist government can look very different from another government which is equally socialist. So the idea that there's one model is not the case. But there are 2 important pillars of socialism. One of which is collective ownership of the means of production, which either means that every industry is owned collectively by those who work in that industry, or that those industries are operated in such a way as to be democratically accountable. The latter model incorporates the government ownership of an industry, like, say, for example, healthcare. I think that's a fine model. I prefer ownership by individual workers. That's my personal preference. There are things the government would probably need to manage directly. I think healthcare is an example of that. The second pillar of socialism is the abolition of the means of production. That is to say, you no longer produce things for the purpose of selling those things to make a profit. Instead, you produce things to benefit society. Wait, did I say something incorrect? Did I say abolish the means of production? I did say that, didn't I? Okay, my apologies. The abolition of the commodity form. Don't abolish the means of production. We want those. Don't take those away. We need those. Don't leave those. Those are ours. Keep those. Yeah, that's Ann Prim shit. Yeah. Um, sorry. Abolishing the commodity form, where you no longer produce things to sell them. So, with the abolition of the commodity form, you essentially decommodify an industry. Government run healthcare would be an example of decommodifying the healthcare industry. That's something I support. Now, there are many types of socialism. I'm in favor, at least for the moment, of market socialism, because I think it would be a good way of putting the right people in charge of society, the workers, the people who live here, not just a very small group of them, while preserving some of the economic functions that allow us to trade with the rest of the world and to maintain uh, systems up until the point where we're capable of decommodifying them responsibly. I think that's a very important distinction. The fact of the matter is, if we abolish the commodity form day one, it would be really, really difficult to trade in the world market, and that would lead to some really negative externalities, both domestically and abroad. So one step at a time. But let's say market socialism, huh? Let's that would be what I tend to push for. Do you believe in the $0 worldview, where every dollar an executive earns is a dollar taken from a blue-collar worker? Why is the two people with separate jobs and responsibility earning the same dollar? So, if you're asking if I believe that economics is a zero-sum game, the answer is absolutely not. That is objectively not the case. However, it remains the case that one entity having a tremendous amount of money can be to the detriment of other entities. Anybody who's ever protested government tax rates knows that to be the case. Just because economics isn't a zero-sum game doesn't mean there isn't something to be said about a society with a record number of billionaires and homeless people. There is something to look at there. Maybe think, poke and prod your brain a little bit. You know what I'm talking about. The Walton family member running Walmart doesn't do the same thing or have the responsibilities of a cashier. So, of course, shouldn't their pay scale be different? If you're asking if people, so in a society that still has a currency, which market socialism would, should all people be paid the same? The answer is no, probably not for all industries. There are different levels of responsibilities assumed in different industries, in different roles. My goal would be to make that process democratic. So, rather than the Walton family being some hereditary aristocrat that lords over Walmart, the CEO or the chief manager essentially would be elected or voted on by a council of thus represented workers beneath them, and those councils could determine the wages of the people above them. And I don't think any such system would procure CEOs that make like $6 million a year. Probably not. I have a feeling they're probably not going to vote that in. The common cashiers probably aren't going to be like, let's just, let's vote on that. Unless they're really fucking good CEOs. Well, they'd have to be very impressive. No, not everybody needs to make the same amount of money. Everybody needs to make enough money to live comfortably and a dignified life. And I'm okay with collectively owned businesses delegating responsibilities to an individual and being rewarded with more money as such. That's a good middle step between collective ownership and the abolition of the commodity form. I think that's a fine thing. How does socialism account for the fact that not all people are the same? Some have stronger work ethic, skills, artistic abilities, and definitely life experience. I think socialism accounts for this better than anything else. Capitalism, the way it structures its economy, such to the extent that the only viable ways to make your living are by things that make a profit for another individual. This disincentivizes people from producing art. You don't have to look very far online to see massive communities of incredibly talented people who are wasting their lives just as cashiers. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a cashier, but if you're an incredibly talented artist or a woodworker or something like that, and you can't find a way to make money off that craft, either because you don't have the startup capital necessary or just because you're unlucky, which is a thing that happens under market economies, it's just really sad that those people are doing things that so misalign with their skill set. I think that a system which affords every person a baseline level of material comfort would allow people to be more experimental in what they pursue. And additionally, because there will need to be cashiers and there will need to be people who do these jobs, I think that if those industries, service industry, waste plant, sewer cleanup, whatever, are managed democratically, I think it would be much easier for the people who work there to enjoy the time they spend at that job. I can tell you this pretty easily, okay? Half the reason why service work in America sucks is because your manager is a tyrant and they're not on your side. They're on the fucking boss's side and they're on the customer side, okay? When the manager isn't on your side, you are fucked. Like, if you're like a cashier or like a restaurant worker, nothing hurts more than having a manager who isn't on your side. But if you vote for your manager better be on your fucking side. Absolutely. If your manager only gets to keep that position because they get voted in by their fucking coworkers, then, oh yeah, they'd better be on your side. That is a very strong incentive. Not a perfect solution to these problems, but a strong incentive. But I'm glad people are different. Yeah, the differences between individuals, the variety between people, I think this is critical. It's very important. It's necessary. Do you think automation should be encouraged in a socialist society? Yeah, of course. Automation is only a crisis under capitalism. People freak out. What about the unemployment? How the fuck does a society becoming more efficient? How on earth does an increase in the efficiency of a society lead to an economic crisis? How the fuck does that happen? What the fuck? That's so fucking weird. Can you imagine? Like, fucking 400 years ago, they're like, no, you can't invent this loom. Think of all the textile jobs you'll put out. Like, fuck, come on. Systems by which you can automate menial work are phenomenal. They're good. It's a good thing. It's good. No, that did happen. Yes, that did happen. The issue is the Luddites were angry because they were being treated like shit. That was the main issue there. That's the thing. But those Luddites lived under capitalism. The reason why they were angry is because they were all fucking John Henrying. They were doing the shit on their own, and then when automation came around, they got fucked for it. Why should they get fucked for it? Ideally, an increase in the efficiency of society should mean there's more money and more labor time to go around. Being different is a good thing, right? But studied the manifesto by Marx in my college worldview class over and over again. When his theory was tested against free will and capitalism, it failed. I don't think that Marx or socialism really has anything to do with free will. I don't know what that means necessarily. I'll tell you, in my opinion, I've noticed some of your arguments in your videos. You do a few things to help your case. I'm being criticized here. You speak in half-truths. You don't follow through because if you do, you would lose the argument. You place a lot of assumptions into people's mouths with your comments and interjections to make your arguments. You choose to ignore the Constitution of this country. You also seem to ignore the fact that, as I referenced, the manifesto that socialism is a step to communism, and we both know until there's a great reset or a giant shift, will never work with free-willed, educated people. Okay, so I can't speak to your criticisms of my character or my debate tactics, but I think the last point here expresses kind of a bit of ignorance on your part. So what they say is, you also seem to ignore the fact that, as I referenced the manifesto, that socialism is a step to communism. Yes, socialism is a step to communism, that's true. And we both know until there is a great reset or other giant shift, that will never work with the free-willed, educated people. So the existence of free will and of educated people are literally the benchmark of socialist advocacy. Educated people are educated of their own tyranny, or of the tyranny they experience. And people who are free-willed are people who work to make their lives better. It is through the suppression of free will by the wage slavery system that we live within that so few people dream of something more. Think of, like, we live in the wealthiest country in the history of the planet. We live in the world of dreams. We could do anything we wanted if we wanted, but we don't. And that is, in part, because a lot of people have a very limited set of expectations about what is possible and what should be done. And I think that socialists and socialism in general are good at opening their eyes to that effect. That's what's called class consciousness. And it's something that I think is very pog. It's also a misunderstanding of what communism is. Remember, people, what Marx believed in more than anything else, what did Marx believe in, folks? I've said this before. Did Marx believe in equality? Was that what Marx pushed for? No. Marx did not push for equality. Marx pushed for freedom. Freedom in the sense that we have few restrictions on our behavior, as long as we're not hurting other people, but mostly freedom to do with your life what you want to do. A freedom you do not have in a wage slave society. I believe we have just one more. Oh, no, I believe it's two more, but that's okay. Hold on. So this email was from somebody who described themselves as a conflicted Tucker Carlson-loving leftist. There's a lot typed out here, but the gist of it is essentially that they get a lot of catharsis out of watching Tucker Carlson lambast the elites. Here, in their words, it's this. I watch Tucker Carlson solely because of the immense emotional satisfaction I get from hearing him call out the BS of smug, woke-scold liberals. He does do that very well. The appreciation I have for him doing this is so great that I'm able to overlook everything else that I disagree with him about that would otherwise make me not want to watch him. So this to me sounds like a person asking me how they can best stop mainlining crack cocaine, okay? Or like you're asking me to help you put down the heroin needle. It is indeed very satisfying to see the woke-scold liberals made fun of, but you have to recognize that you're hearing it from like a white nationalist. Like, I know you know this, but like, Tucker Carlson is an incredibly and aggressively pro-establishment, pro-race, he's like every bad political thing wrapped up in a little bundle. I get it's satisfying to hear him rail against these types, but this is the reason why content creators who only attack positions they don't like often are really destructive and have communities that go way the fuck too far. That's a very common thing. And the main reason for that is because if all you do is criticize a position, you're not really like forming a strong, like concrete position yourself. You're opening yourself up to a lot of really weird backlash. Like how the anti-SJW craze in 2014 turned into a bunch of fucking neo-Nazism today. You have to be careful with that stuff. So please, there are other places where you can watch smug, woke-scold liberals get dunked on, okay? I promise you there are other outlets. But, man, if you're going to keep watching that stuff, just make sure that you're not picking up on any of the political messaging that he's trying to deliver to you, because that's his goal. Tucker Carlson's goal is not to point out that the lefties are woke-scolds. It's to move America in a decidedly worse direction. So, yeah, just make sure you don't fall for it, you know? All right. No, sure, boy. I recognize that the sexes are also social constructs. I recognize that. I was just talking earlier about the binomial bimodal. Sorry, the bimodal distribution for sex, which is pretty sharp. You know, it's pretty distinguished. We have one last one. Why socialism? I'm not really a conservative. I would say I'm a social democrat, and I understand some of the criticisms of capitalism, but I'm not sold on socialism or even communism. From my understanding, under capitalism, there will always be a hierarchy, but what's the problem with that hierarchy if the wage gap isn't that huge? I guess I just can't imagine anything past a social democracy, and I'm having trouble understanding how socialism could be better than any other economic system. You definitely pushed me left during this pandemic. I just don't get why anything would be better than social democracy. Love your videos, though. Sorry I'm a lib XD. That's okay. So I'm going to address this simply because this could be talked about for hours. You're experiencing capitalist realism right now. It's an old quote. What's the quote? It's for some it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. It's a very deliberate product of your cultural education. So I want to say this. First and foremost, you have to recognize that the fight for the rights of workers has always been a fight against the bourgeois. At all points in capitalist society, whether you live in America or Finland, whether you are a wage slave cashier worker or a lawyer or whatever other kind of worker, labor aristocracy or otherwise, your fight has always been against a very concentrated group of select economic interests. And that is the fight that has been waged for hundreds of years. There are many problems that we experience in this country right now that I would argue come down to class warfare. something which can't be addressed merely through social democracy. So long as there are multiple classes, there will be class warfare because those two classes have distinct political and economic interests. The bourgeois and the proletariat, those are the two classes people typically talk about. If you want to, you can stratify these into a bunch of like subsets, you know, like the petite bourgeois and the regular bourgeois, and you have the labor aristocracy and the lumpen proletariat, and you can distinguish it as much as you want. But to keep it simple, you have the bourgeois and the proletariat, and it is largely the bourgeois who have political power in basically every country on earth, to varying extents, of course. Some European countries afford them less power than America does, but that's generally how things work out. And there are many problems we face in this world, one example of which I would argue is climate change, which are a direct product of that class antagonism. One of the reasons why climate change is the issue it seems to be is because initial reporting about the effect that the coal and oil industries were having on the environment were suppressed or delegitimized by the very, very powerful bourgeois and the politicians who were in their pocket. Likewise, in countries where there is currently a robust debate about whether or not climate change is even a real thing, you'll find that Murdoch, the owner of Fox News, has a prominent media presence. It seems like a lot of this big issue we're dealing with doesn't even come down to workers' rights or protesting against big government. It comes down to the fundamental fact that a small group of powerful people have a different set of interests. The wealthy aren't affected by climate change. The uber wealthy, you think they mind? There are already news articles out there about how the uber billionaires are forming their climate doomsday bunkers. They'll just live on a yacht, a permanent solar-powered yacht that floats around the new pan-Atlantic Pacific Ocean that stretches across. The Panama Canal will be flooded, and the channel 100 miles wide will be. Then they'll just float around it. They don't care, you know. We get affected by it. The people who get affected most by climate change, that's the global south, baby. All the hundreds of thousands of people in Southeast Asia and otherwise who will be forced to move out of their homes to flee as the coastline encroaches on their city. That's going to affect a lot of people. It's going to cause a lot of problems, and that is very directly because, you boil it right down to it, that is because a very small group of very wealthy people wanted to make more money, so they suppressed alternative energy sources, downplayed scientific journals, which laid to bear the crimes they were committing, and lobbied politicians to not enforce any sort of regulation on their industries. Social democracy can't really fix that. And with a lot of other problems like this, you'll find that the issue isn't so much a matter of regulation as it is where you're putting the cards to begin with. I ask you, if there is a small group of people with a lot of power and they are doing shit that fucks over society and fucks over the working poor and fucks over everyone except themselves, and they're the ones in charge, what makes more sense? Waging a perpetual war against them or just getting rid of them? Just getting rid of that class distinction? Because to me, the latter makes more sense. I would much, much, much rather just get rid of the class antagonism to begin with. Just get rid of that issue, you know? Quit Pepe posting. You know what I mean. Through market socialism and the acquisition of the means of production by the common worker, there will no longer be bourgeois. The bourgeois are those who privately own the means of production, but if everybody owns the means of production, there can't be a bourgeois. It's all proletariat. You see? In many ways, social democracy is attempting to put a Band-Aid on a festering wound. It's a refusal to treat it with surgery. But you can never get rid of the wound underneath. It's infected. You have to do something more substantial. There are many good things social democrats can do for society. And it is possible, hypothetically, it is conceivable that social democracy could achieve a very wonderful society, very, very good, with sufficient regulation and what have you. But always underneath that lays the seed of potential future fuckery, because you haven't really fixed one of the big underlying issues. Now, if you get more into socialist theory and you get more into political theory, you learn that there are other issues with capitalism that fundamentally cannot be addressed through social democracy and regulation, not just those with the bourgeois, but also what about alienation? without workers controlling the means of production, it's very difficult to develop society in such a way as to manage the living expectations and the labor requirements of individuals in such a way as to benefit them personally, uh, physiologically. That the way our economy is structured right now is very alienating. It's very distanced. And that's a problem that's fundamental to market economies. So we could do something about that. We also have the fact that, frankly, I just think fundamentally it's probably more ethical to democratically own the means of production. Does anyone else think that way? I mean, it's just weird. Like, we're fighting to defend autocracy, Like, give me 80,000 examples and arguments as to why we should democratize businesses. Like, we like democracy. All right. I don't know. There are other arguments, and they get increasingly esoteric, but Vosh, why are ex-commie states so racist and bigoted? Well, there have never been, first of all, commie state doesn't, What you're talking about are like ex-Soviet satellite countries, and the reason why they tend to be so racist and so bigoted is because A, the Soviet Union was not very socially progressive in many ways, and B, the collapse of the Soviet Union gave power to a lot of far-right autocrats that have since achieved political power by playing off the populist xenophobia of their population. That's the main reason why. Generally speaking, when governments collapse, bad things happen. Yeah. What would stop the workers still abusing the environment for profit? The answer is this. For one, now that the people who have the power to abuse the environment are working class, they now are directly hurt by the consequences of their own actions. The working people at the oil gas company incorporated, these people can't go buy a yacht that holds 250,000 people. They're directly on the hook for what they do. They suffer the consequences. They have the same material interests as the rest of us. So for that reason, they might make better choices. Additionally, the democratic structure of a worker cooperative lends to a much greater degree of transparency. It's way easier, I think, to know what's going on within a company when these decisions are being made in a way which is deliberately transparent, such as to inform the workers as to who they should be voting for to represent them. I think that makes it a lot easier. And finally, the third point is that without the distinct class interests of the bourgeois, it would be much harder to lobby politicians in order to prevent regulation or to suppress scientific dissident. Does that make sense? Those are the basic arguments. I think I argued with Destiny about this at some point. What about the emergence of extremely successful proles that can use their wealth in the way the bourgeois do? I don't think you could have billionaires in a worker cooperative driven society. I don't think a market socialist society could really do that. But even if they were wealthy, because of the way the economy is structured, they wouldn't be able to delineate their class distinction anywhere near as well. They would be wealthy, sure, they would be comfortable, but there wouldn't be an underlying system that allows the bourgeois to influence society in a different way. Vosh, but won't they just keep on drilling oil if they kept their jobs? Yeah, of course. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution. Making an oil or a gas company a worker cooperative only provides a better incentive structure and makes it easier to challenge their institutional power. It doesn't, like, on its own get rid of fossil fuel or anything. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to any of these issues, but I think these are ways in which socialism would absolutely make things better, at least in some ways. So there you go.